The Last Kingdom shows Alfred the Great as a sickly king who prays while Uhtred wins his wars for him. Vikings barely lets him speak before he's shuffled off screen. The real Alfred didn't hide behind anyone's sword. In the spring of 878, he was the only reason England still existed at all. Here's what both shows completely ignore. By the time Alfred became a fugitive in the Somerset Marshes, 3 English kingdoms were already gone. Northumbria gone, East Anglia gone, Mercia broken and reduced to a puppet state. Wessex was the last kingdom standing, and Wessex was down to 1 king, hiding in a swamp, with what was left of his household guard. This wasn't a subplot. This was the end of English history, about to happen, and one man stopped it. Not with a single duel. Not with a rescue by a fictional sword arm invented for television. With a winter of raids from a swamp fortress, a summer battle won on discipline and timing, and a decade of reform after the fighting stopped. That's a harder story to dramatize than a sword fight. It's also the true one. To understand Alfred, you need to understand the Great Heathen Army. In 865, a Viking force landed in East Anglia, unlike anything England had seen before. Earlier raids were smash and grab. Coastal monasteries hit, treasure taken, longships gone before anyone could respond. This army was different. This army came to stay. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it the Great Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. Later legend, centuries after the fact, claimed it was led by the sons of the semi-legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, seeking revenge for his death. That origin story is folklore layered onto history, impossible to verify, and probably at least partly invented. What the sources do agree on is the leadership on the ground, warlords like Ivar and Halfdan commanding a coalition force large enough and disciplined enough to conquer kingdoms rather than simply raid them. Historians still argue over exactly how many warriors that meant. Older accounts, taking medieval chroniclers at their word, imagined tens of thousands. Revisionist scholarship over the last few decades has argued for something far smaller, perhaps a few thousand, pointing out that medieval writers routinely inflated enemy numbers to make victories look more impressive and defeats look less shameful. The debate isn't settled, and probably never will be. What both camps agree on is this. However many warriors it took, this force moved on captured horses, wintered inside fortified English towns rather than sailing home each autumn, and behaved less like raiders and more like an occupying army. Enough to break kingdoms, regardless of the exact head count. Viking raids on England weren't new in 865. Monks at Lindisfarne had recorded the terror of the first coastal raid as early as 793, nearly 70 years earlier. What changed in 865 wasn't that Vikings arrived. It's that, for the first time, they didn't leave. 1. Geography. England in the 9th century wasn't one country. It was 4 kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, often at war with each other, never fully united. 2. Division. That fractured political map meant the Vikings could isolate each kingdom and destroy it alone. 3. Resources. The Great Heathen Army didn't just raid. It settled, farmed, and reinforced itself year after year, while English kingdoms bled men they couldn't replace. Northumbria fell first. In 866, the army took York. The following year, 2 rival Northumbrian kings, Aella and Osbert, briefly set aside their feud to attack the Viking-held city together. Both died. Northumbria became a puppet kingdom, then no kingdom at all. East Anglia went next. In 869, King Edmund was killed by the Viking army, later remembered as a martyr, canonized as Saint Edmund, his death wrapped in legend within a generation. The historical record of exactly how he died is thin. That he died and that East Anglia fell with him is not in doubt. Mercia held longer, but not much longer. By 874, its king, Burhs, had fled to Rome. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler in his place. Mercia, the kingdom that had once dominated England under kings like Offa, was now a client state of the men who had conquered it. That left Wessex. One kingdom, one royal house. And by January 878, one king with almost nothing left. This matters because every version of this story that starts with Alfred already skips the part that explains him. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was the last king of the last kingdom, and everyone in England, English and Viking alike, knew it. Alfred was not supposed to be king. Born around 849 in Wantage, he was the youngest of 5 sons of King Ethelwulf of Wessex. Youngest sons didn't inherit thrones. Wessex, unusually for the period, had settled on a pact between Ethelwulf's adult sons. Each brother would take the crown in turn, rather than pass it down to young children, a system built for survival in a kingdom that could not afford a child king during a war. 3 of Alfred's brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, each held the throne before him, one after another, as Viking pressure on Wessex grew year on year. Alfred grew up fully expecting to spend his life as a spare, not a ruler. Asa, the Welsh monk who wrote Alfred's biography around 893, describes a boy who loved poetry and struggled, in his own words, to master reading as quickly as he wanted to. One story, often repeated and probably at least partly true, has his mother offering an illuminated book of English poetry to whichever of her sons could learn to recite it first. Alfred won it. He was sent to Rome as a small child, and again a few years later, traveling with his father, where the Pope may have anointed him in a ceremony later English writers inflated into something closer to a coronation. It almost certainly wasn't one. Alfred had 3 older brothers standing between him and the crown, and no reasonable person in the 850s expected him to wear it. A quick word on that source, because honesty about it matters. Asa's Life of King Alfred is the single richest window into Alfred as a person, but it's not a neutral document. Asa was a churchman writing for Alfred's court, with every incentive to flatter his patron. A small number of historians have gone further, questioning whether parts of the text as it survives were altered or even partly composed later than Asa's lifetime. Most specialists still treat it as broadly genuine and enormously valuable. But broadly genuine isn't the same as beyond question, and this channel would rather tell you that than pretend the record is cleaner than it is. Here's the key thing. This early Alfred bookish, pious, sickly is real. Asa describes a chronic illness that struck Alfred around the time of his wedding in 868, some mysterious, recurring pain that plagued him for the rest of his life. Modern writers have speculated it resembled Crohn's disease, or a severe case of piles, or something else entirely. The exact diagnosis is unrecoverable across 11 centuries of medical distance. The shows aren't wrong that Alfred was devout, or that he suffered physically. They're wrong about what that meant. Piety and weakness are not the same thing. Alfred prayed. Alfred also killed men in open battle before he was 22 years old. In 871, remembered in the Chronicle as Wessex's year of battles, the kingdom fought the Great Heathen Army something like 9 times. A brutal, grinding sequence, kingdom against army, month after month. It didn't start well. At Reading, in January, Ethelred and Alfred's combined force was pushed back with heavy losses, including the death of an alderman named Ethelwulf, who had won an earlier skirmish against a Viking raiding party. 4 days later came Ashdown. Alfred, then a prince serving under his brother King Ethelred, fought at the Battle of Ashdown. The Chronicle describes the Viking army holding higher ground, split into 2 divisions under 2 kings. Ethelred delayed, still hearing mass, unwilling to break off before the service ended. Alfred didn't wait. He led the West Saxon charge himself against the Viking shield formation uphill into a fight the West Saxons were not favored to win. Wessex won. One Viking king, Bagsec, died on the field alongside 5 Viking earls. The fighting didn't stop after Ashdown. 2 weeks later, at Basing, the Vikings won. A few weeks after that, at a site called Meriton, the two sides fought again, and again the outcome was mixed. A hard-fought battle, the sources describe as going Wessex's way for most of the day before the Vikings ultimately held the field. This is the honest shape of 871. Not a clean run of victories, but a relentless, exhausting sequence of battles that wore down both sides, with Wessex just barely staying upright by the end of it. Ethelred died a few months later, worn down by the year's fighting, probably from wounds or illness rather than a single blow. Alfred became King of Wessex in April 871, not because he wanted the crown early, but because there was no one else left to take it, and the Great Heathen Army was still in the field. For the next several years, Alfred did something the shows almost never credit him for. He survived. Wessex paid tribute Danelaw to buy time, and the Viking army turned its attention north, finishing off Mercia, while an uneasy quiet held over Wessex. That decision gets mocked by history as cowardice. It wasn't. It was a young king, badly outnumbered, choosing to live to fight a war he could eventually win, rather than lose everything in a battle he couldn't. The peace never really held. In 876, a Viking force under Guthrum slipped past Alfred's watch and seized Wareham. Alfred blockaded them there, and the two sides swore oaths on a sacred ring to keep the peace oaths the Vikings broke almost immediately, escaping under cover of night to Exeter instead. Alfred pursued and besieged them there too. And then something happened that the shows never mention, because it didn't involve Alfred's sword at all. A Viking relief fleet, sailing to reinforce Guthrum at Exeter, was wrecked in a storm off Swanage. Historians disagree on the exact scale of the loss, but the effect is clear enough. Guthrum's force limped into 877 weaker than it had been in years. Which makes what happened next even more remarkable. On the 6th of January, 878, Twelfth night, deep in what should have been the off-season for campaigning, Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack on the royal estate at Chippenham, where Alfred was wintering with his court. This is the kind of assault no medieval army expected in the depths of winter, when campaigns were supposed to stop entirely. Alfred's household was scattered. Some ealdormen and thanes fled overseas rather than face what looked like the final collapse of Wessex. Some submitted to Guthrum outright. Alfred himself escaped with a small band of followers into the Somerset Marshes. This is where the Last Kingdom loves to park him weak, praying, waiting to be rescued. Here's what actually happened. Alfred didn't cower in Athelney. He fortified it. Local tradition and the sources together describe the site known then as Athelney, roughly the Island of Princes, as raised, defensible ground surrounded by wetland, reachable only by a narrow causeway Alfred's men could control and defend. Athelney, the alderman of Somerset, joined him there with local fighters who knew the marshes better than any Viking scout ever would. From this base, Alfred didn't wait passively for salvation. He ran a guerrilla campaign. Small raiding parties struck Viking positions and supply lines throughout the winter and early spring. He sent word through Wessex quietly, carefully, through a network that still trusted him that the king was alive and Wessex wasn't finished. This wasn't survival. This was strategy. A king rebuilding an army from a swamp, one loyal thane at a time. By May 878, Alfred was ready. He left Athelney and marched to Egbert's Stone on the edge of Selwood Forest, where the Fyrd, the levied militia of Somerset, Wiltshire, and part of Hampshire assembled to meet him. The Chronicle records that when the men of Wessex saw their king alive, they rejoiced. That's not sentiment. That's the entire war turning on a single fact. Alfred had not been broken, and Wessex knew it. From Egbert's Stone, Alfred marched the army for roughly 3 days to Edington, recorded in the Chronicle as Ethandun, its exact location debated by historians but generally placed near modern Westbury in Wiltshire, where Guthrum's force was encamped. What followed on that field decided the future of England. The Chronicle's account is brief but decisive. Alfred formed his shield wall a locked line of men and shields, the standard tactic of the age, and advanced against the Viking army. The fighting was close, brutal, and, according to the sources, long. Alfred's forces broke the Viking line, and then did something armies of the period frequently failed to do. They pursued. Guthrum's survivors fled to their fortress at Chippenham, and Alfred didn't let them regroup. He besieged the fortress for roughly a fortnight, cutting off food, cutting off hope, until Guthrum had nothing left to negotiate with but surrender. Rhetorical question worth sitting with. How does a king with no kingdom, no army, and no allies beat the force that had just conquered 3 other English kingdoms in 13 years? The honest answer is that he didn't get lucky. A weakened enemy fleet, a mobilized Fyrd at exactly the right moment, ground and timing chosen on his terms rather than Guthrum's, and a refusal to stop fighting once the battle was technically won. Historians disagree on the precise size of either army. Contemporary chroniclers were not counting heads accurately, and later estimates range widely. What isn't disputed is the outcome. Edington wasn't the end of the war. It was the end of the idea that Wessex could be conquered. What Alfred did next mattered as much as the battle itself. Guthrum surrendered and agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred standing as his godfather. The ceremony, the unbinding of the chrism, the ritual removal of the baptismal cloth 8 days after the baptism itself, took place at Alla, followed by a 12-day feast at Wedmore. Historians still debate how much of Guthrum's conversion was genuine faith and how much was political theatre required to seal a peace. Probably both, in proportions we will never fully recover. What came out of Wedmore was more than a truce. It was the foundation for a settlement later formalized in a treaty between Alfred and Guthrum that divided England along a rough line. Later generations would call the boundary of the Danelaw, running broadly along the Thames, up the River Lee, and along the old Roman road of Watling Street toward Chester. North and east of that line, Scandinavian law, Scandinavian settlement, a different England under different rule. South and west, Wessex and Alfred's authority, intact and secured. This wasn't just a battle won. It was a border drawn, a treaty signed, and a kingdom saved by negotiation as much as by the sword. The later formal treaty between Alfred and Guthrum survives in writing, and it's worth pausing on what it actually says. It doesn't just mark a boundary. It sets out equivalent legal standing between Englishmen and Dane comparable weregild, the compensation payable for a person's death, on both sides of the line. Whatever else it was, this wasn't a document written by a king planning to exterminate his former enemies. It was a document written by a king planning to live next to them, permanently, as neighbors, rather than as an occupier and the occupied. Here's what really happened after that. The part the shows skip entirely, because it doesn't involve a single dramatic sword fight. Alfred spent the rest of his reign making sure Edington could never need to happen again. He built the burghal system, a network of roughly 33 fortified settlements across Wessex, from Winchester to Wallingford to Exeter, spaced so that no part of the kingdom was more than a day's march from a defensible stronghold. The burghal hidage, a document from later in Alfred's reign or shortly after, lists these forts and the number of hides of land, a unit tied to military obligation, assigned to maintain and defend each one. This wasn't decoration. It was a system engineered so that the next Viking army to land would find fortified towns everywhere it turned, garrisoned by local men obligated by law to defend them. He reformed the Fyrd itself, splitting the militia so that part was always in the field while part stayed home to work the land and guard the Burhs, solving the structural problem that had let Guthrum catch Wessex unprepared in the first place. A militia forced to choose between farming and fighting eventually fails at both. Alfred's reform meant it no longer had to choose. And, per the Chronicle's own account, Alfred ordered new ships built longer, faster, and higher than the Danish vessels, some reportedly with 60 oars or more to meet Viking raiders at sea before they ever reached English shores. The Chronicle is honest that the design wasn't perfect. Some of these new ships ran aground in their first engagement, too large and unfamiliar for the men crewing them. Whether this constitutes a formally organized navy in the modern sense is debated by historians. What isn't debated is that Alfred was the first English king to systematically contest Viking raiders on the water rather than only on land. The system was tested again. In 892, a fresh Viking force under a warlord named Hæstein landed in Kent, hoping to repeat what the Great Heathen Army had achieved a generation earlier. This time, Wessex didn't buckle. The Burhs held. The reformed Fyrd responded faster. London recaptured by Alfred in 886 and placed under the authority of his son-in-law, Ethelred of Mercia, married to Alfred's daughter, Ethelflaed, stood as a fortified anchor rather than an open target. By 896, the renewed invasion had fizzled out, not through one decisive battle, but through a kingdom too well defended to crack. This wasn't one victory. It was an entire kingdom, re-engineered, top to bottom, by a man the shows can't be bothered to let out of a church pew. Now, the cakes. If you know one story about Alfred the Great, it's probably this one. A peasant woman shelters the fugitive king, not recognizing him, and asks him to watch her cakes baking on the fire. Alfred, consumed by the weight of his kingdom's collapse, lets them burn. She scolds him furiously. He accepts the rebuke without revealing who he is. It's a wonderful story. It is almost certainly not true. The tale doesn't appear in Asser's contemporary biography. It doesn't appear in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It surfaces more than a century after Alfred's death, in the life of Saint Neot, woven into a saint's legend rather than a historical record. The kind of moralizing folk tale medieval writers loved to attach to famous kings, to make abstract virtues like humility feel human and specific. Somewhere between the 11th century and the Victorian schoolroom, where it was reprinted in engravings and children's histories for generations, it stopped being read as folklore and started being taught as fact. This matters because it's the perfect miniature of what happened to Alfred's entire reputation. The real story, a king rebuilding an army, a kingdom and a legal system from a swamp, got quietly swapped for a smaller, gentler, more forgettable one. A burnt cake is easier to remember than a burghal defense network. It's also a lot less true to who Alfred actually was. What if Alfred had lost at Edington? Guthrum's army wasn't looking for tribute anymore by 878. It was looking to finish what the Great Heathen Army had started 13 years earlier, the complete conquest of England. Northumbria, East Anglia, and most of Mercia were already under Scandinavian control or influence. Wessex was the last obstacle standing between the Vikings and total dominance of the island south of Scotland. A Wessex defeat at Edington probably doesn't mean an instant end to English resistance. Pockets of local defiance likely would have continued for years, the way Northumbrian and Mercian resistance sputtered on in fragments after their own kingdoms fell. But it plausibly means no unified kingdom of Wessex to serve as the nucleus of a later unified England. No Alfred to build the burghs that held the line for his son, Edward the Elder, and his grandson, Aethelstan, to later push the Danelaw back and, within a generation of Alfred's death, unify the English kingdoms into one under a single crown. Without that foundation, there's a real possibility England as a political idea simply never crystallizes in the 10th century, or crystallizes centuries later under entirely different rulers, quite possibly speaking a different language. This isn't guaranteed history. It's informed speculation, and honest historians treat it as exactly that. But the through line is hard to avoid. The England that eventually absorbed the Danelaw, wrote in Old English rather than Old Norse as its dominant tongue, and produced the political structures the Norman conquerors inherited in 1066, that England exists because one battle, on one day in May 878, went one particular way. It's worth noticing, too, what this counterfactual does to the shows themselves. Both Vikings and the Last Kingdom are, in their own ways, stories about a fictional or semi-fictional warrior navigating a world defined by real historical outcomes, a united, Christian, English-speaking Wessex, surviving into the 10th century. Strip Alfred's actual achievement out of the background, and the entire world those shows are set in stops making sense. The fictional heroes only get to have their adventures because a very real king did the unglamorous work of making sure there was still a kingdom left to have adventures in. Consider how fragile the actual sequence of events was. A storm off Swanage wrecked a relief fleet in 877. A network of loyal thanes kept faith with a fugitive king through a single winter in 878. A Fyrd showed up at Egbert's Stone when it could just as easily have stayed home, calculating the war was already lost. Change any one of those small facts, and the story of England changes with it. That's not the tidy, inevitable march of destiny historical drama likes to imply. It's a near thing, decided by people who could have chosen differently and didn't. Here's where the stakes of the story become clear. This isn't a swashbuckling side quest to make Uhtred's arc more interesting. This is the hinge point of English history, and it turned on a king the show's treatise furniture. So why do we remember the cakes and forget the boors? Why does popular culture default to a soft, sidelined Alfred when the historical record is this clear? Partly it's dramatic convenience. Fictional protagonists need room to be the hero. A king who already won the war, already built the defense network, and already secured the peace doesn't leave much space for an invented warrior like Uhtred to matter. Sidelining Alfred isn't necessarily malicious. It's a storytelling choice that makes the fictional lead look bigger by making the historical king look smaller. Partly it's the piety trap. Alfred genuinely was devout, genuinely did translate religious texts, genuinely did structure his life around Christian practice, in a way that reads, to modern audiences, steeped in different assumptions about what strength looks like, as passive or weak. But 9th century kingship didn't separate faith from ruthlessness. A king could believe fervently in his religion and still burn Guthrum's supply lines, besiege his fortress, and force his surrender. The shows collapse that complexity into a simple binary pious, therefore soft, that the sources simply don't support. And partly, it's because the cake story is just more fun than the burghal high dodge. A king humbled by a peasant woman is a better campfire tale than a document listing hide assignments for fortress garrisons. Folklore survives because it's memorable, not because it's accurate. That's true of Alfred, and it's true of most of what popular culture thinks it knows about the medieval period. Here's why the title, The Great, matters. Alfred is the only English monarch, in over 1,000 years of English kings and queens, to carry that title as part of his historical name. Not William the Conqueror, not Henry VIII for all his infamy, not Elizabeth I for all her long, celebrated reign. Alfred alone. Historians in the centuries after his death gave him that title specifically because of what he did after Edington, not the battle itself, but the systematic, deliberate work of turning a battlefield survival into a kingdom that could outlast him. After the war, Alfred didn't stop working. In the preface to his translation of Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, Alfred himself, in his own words, rendered into English rather than Latin for the first time, lamented how badly learning had collapsed south of the Humber during decades of Viking war, and set out a program to have young, free-born Englishmen taught to read their own language before they moved on to Latin. He gathered scholars from beyond Wessex to help rebuild what the war had gutted. Asser from Wales, Grimbold from Flanders, John, sometimes called John the Old Saxon, and later Plegmund, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. Together with Alfred, this circle produced English translations of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Augustine's Soliloquies, and likely contributed to the compiling of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself during Alfred's reign, meaning some of the very sources this video draws on were shaped, directly or indirectly, by the king they describe. He also issued a law code, the Dom-Bok, drawing on earlier laws from Kentish and Mercian kings and, notably, on Mosaic law from the Old Testament. framing Wessex's legal identity as something rooted in a larger Christian and historical tradition rather than invented from nothing. This is the Alfred the shows never get to. Not because the sources are silent, they aren't, but because a translator sitting with a Latin manuscript doesn't make for good television. A burning church makes for good television. A king quietly deciding that his kingdom needs an educated clergy and a written legal code to survive the next 100 years does not. There's a physical object that captures this side of Alfred better than any battle could. In 1693, a small, exquisitely crafted gold and enamel object was found near Athelney, the same marshes Alfred once hid in. It's known today as the Alfred Jewel, and it carries an Old English inscription that translates roughly as, "Alfred ordered me made." Most historians believe it was the handle for an estelle, a pointer used to follow text while reading, quite possibly one of the very reading tools Alfred sent out, alongside his translated books, to bishops across Wessex as part of his literacy program. A king who commissions elaborate objects to help his clergy read is not a king who has retreated from the world. He's a king still fighting the war, just with a different weapon. And it worked, past his own lifetime. Alfred died in 899. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Athelney, remembered as the Lady of the Mercians, who led armies in her own right against the Danelaw, expanded on his foundations. His grandson, Aethelstan, became in 927 the first king to rule what could genuinely be called a unified England, north and south, English and Dane alike, under one crown. None of that happens without the Burhs, the Fyrd, the Treaty, and the survival in 878 of a king who, by every reasonable expectation of the age, should have simply disappeared into the marshes and never come back. There's one more layer to why Alfred's image keeps shifting, and it has less to do with the 9th century than with the 19th. Victorian Britain, building an empire and looking for a founding hero to match its self-image, seized on Alfred as the origin point of English liberty, English law, and English naval power. In 1901, a millenary commemoration of his death drew crowds to Winchester for the unveiling of a bronze statue of Alfred that still stands in the city today, sword raised, more warrior icon than translator king. That version of Alfred grand, martial, almost mythic, was itself a reinterpretation, shaped by what a Victorian audience needed him to represent. Every generation, it turns out, remakes Alfred in the image it needs. The Victorians needed an empire builder. Modern television needs a supporting character so that a fictional warrior can take the lead. Neither version is quite the man in the sources. The real Alfred wasn't the king hiding while someone else saved England. He was the only reason there was an England left to save the last king standing after 3 kingdoms fell, who rebuilt an army from a swamp, broke Guthrum at Edington, and then spent the rest of his life making sure no English king would ever be driven into a marsh again. Vikings and the Last Kingdom gave you a better sword fight. History gave you a better king.